Hello, everybody, and welcome to our next episode of the Strong Roots and Wide Branches podcast. I will start with prayers like I always do. Today's podcast, we're going to be talking about what I call relational polytheism. So I realized as I've been going through these podcasts that I'm not sure that I've really covered what I'm doing and why. So I wanted to get into today some of the underlying, I guess you could call theology, philosophy of what my approach to polytheism is. I've been calling it the strong roots and wide branches approach to polytheism. What in the world does that actually mean? So we're going to get into some of that today. We'll get into the philosophy, which is fun. I love philosophy. Your mileage may vary, but I think this one should be a fun one. But let's start with prayers because I always start with prayers. So blessings and hail to all good spirits. I call upon the guardians and protectors of this house and land and of this space. Rally round, rally round, rally round. I'm doing the next podcast for Strong Roots and Wide Branches. I call upon the guardians and guides, protect this work, protect this podcast, keep our internet nice and stable. I call upon those blessed powers that guide Strong Roots and Wide Branches, that guide the blessed work of House of Apples. I call upon the land upon which I stand. Blessings to the land. Blessings to the bones in the soil. Blessings to the original inhabitants of these lands. In my case, that would be the Owasso Osaloni speaking ancestors. Blessings to those ancestors. May the ancestors know peace and healing, and may their descendants know sovereignty and justice. Blessings to the ecosystems in which we participate. Blessings to the biomes that we are part of. We'll be talking about biomes today. Biomes are my favorite. Blessings to this moment in space, place, and time. Blessings to you wherever you are in this moment as well. Blessings to our ancestors, those who have come before. Blessings to those wise beings, those wise ones who shape the language that we speak, that shape the frameworks that we lean into. It is thanks to your hard work that we are able to become who we are now moving forward. May the harm that you did in your lifetime be healed, and may the harm that was done to you in your lifetime be healed. Blessings to the wisdom of knowing what to bring forth and what to leave behind. Blessings to the descendants, those who will come later. May your future prayers lift us up as our prayers lift you up, and may we leave behind a legacy we can all be proud of. Blessings to lineage, blessings to the continuation. Blessings to our allies and friends of all types, shapes, and sizes. Blessings to the vast guiding forces that know and shape our destinies. And blessings to the web from which all things come and to which all things return. Blessings to each one of you. Thank you for listening in on my latest podcast. Okay, so we're talking about relational polytheism. What in the world does that mean? The strong roots and wide branches framework of religion is relational polytheism. That's interconnected, interdependent, embedded relationships. It's about the building and maintenance of right relationships with ourselves, with the land around us, with the dead in general, with our own lineages, that would be our ancestors and descendants, with gods, pantheons, the living communities in which we're embedded, and other beings and networks as applicable to our unique situations. The thing is that there isn't really such a thing as one size fits all religion exactly, because each one of us is going to have our own unique lives, our unique wants and needs, and the context in which we're embedded. My context is going to be different than yours. Your context is going to be different than mine. What is going to motivate and drive us? What's going to inspire us? What's going to hold us back? What's going to be real conflicts or concerns or problems in our lives is going to be individual for each person. And so religion gets to be kind of one more piece in that puzzle. How much am I specifically, personally, at this moment in my life going to prioritize it or deprioritize it? Do I even need it at all? Do you even need it at all? It's up to you. These are personal choices. These are deeply, deeply personal choices. And I always like to emphasize that how important it is that this is a personal choice, because personally, I am entirely anti-proselytizing. I think there are a few things more toxic than proselytizing. If somebody is seeking, they'll find it. They'll ask questions. If we start pushing our thoughts and opinions and beliefs on other people, then we're either going to alienate them or brainwash them, and neither one of those things sounds like a good approach. But that's not today's topic. We're not going to be talking about my problems with proselytizing today. That's all right. Anyway, um, yeah. So so relational polytheism, let's go back. Relational polytheism. We can visualize this as ourselves standing at the center of a wagon wheel or spider web. I like both of these images. Each person's individual web of relations is going to look different, and all of our webs are going to be connected to everybody else's webs in a messy, tangled, interconnected whole. While any one of us may stand in the center of our own web, we're also going to be strands in other people's webs as well. So I love this kind of imagery, this complexity, because I feel like that's more real. That's more accurate to at least my experience of being a person walking in the world. Um, so this idea that, I mean, religion almost isn't quite the right word for it, right? It's this web of relations that we are embedded in, each one of us in the center of our own relationship, standing next to other people who are the centers of their own relationships, and then the ways that those relationships interconnect. And so then when we're looking at what is religion or what do I want out of my connection with the numinous, I like to think of this as how we tend all of those different threads. There's, and the numinous is not a single thing either. It's numinous, it's a mystery. But there might be specific parts of that numinous that we feel more drawn to, that we are connecting with. But we want to maintain kind of all of it, right? So how do we maintain right relationship with our own self? But the tools that we're going to lean in on in order to do that is going to look different than the tools we might need to lean in on to establish right relationship with our neighborhood, both our physical neighborhood, the land that is holding the housing in which we're currently residing, etc. Um, what kind of tending might we need to tend our relationship with our own ancestors or with our descendants, with our lineages, with the environment around us, with the world around us, with gods and spirits as we understand those beings? How do we maintain those relationships? Each person's relationships are going to look different, and the appropriate tools that we're going to bring into tending any of those relationships is going to be specific to the relationship and to the person or people or beings in the relationship. I love the imagery of a diverse and thriving forest as well, when we're kind of coming into like, what are the metaphors that speak to this, that make any of this make sense? So the idea of all of the plants and animals, maybe at the ground level, with an entangled network of mycelium underneath the soil, birds and branches overhead. Forests are multi-level and interconnected. They're linked across distances by roots, by mycelium, by bugs and different creatures that travel, by waterways, by wind and weather. Each one of us is embedded as deeply in our spiritual biomes as we are in our physical ones. What we do impacts the webs in which we are embedded, and what happens to those spiritual biomes in which we live impacts us in return. It's never just us. I know that, I grew up here in the United States. I know that many folks who have grown up in the United States we've been embedded in this particular individualistic kind of a mindset. I didn't get that quite in the same way because I also was raised in a semi-insular culture that had a slightly different way of wrapping some of that stuff up. But all of that being said, you're not immune to the world in which you're surrounded, in which you're embedded. And many of us were raised in this sort of overculture of isolationism. So it both keeps us very isolated, but also helps us to, it facilitates the idea that we should be assuming that our actions only affect us, which is absolutely not true. Other people's actions impact us, our actions impact other people, our beliefs and practices impact other people, and we are impacted by other people in the same way. So, um, in different podcasts, I'm going to be covering different specific wagon wheel spokes. Um, while this is my approach, of course, as we get into any of this kind of stuff, you can take or leave my opinions and thoughts as you see fit, obviously. I'm only putting all of this out because this is what I believe and I find it useful. I never want these podcasts to be me telling other people that there is one right way and that one right way is mine. I'm not interested in that. And I sure hope that's not what you're taking from any of this. I'm a lot more interested in asking questions and making suggestions for where to go to find your own answers than I am in actually giving you answers. I'll give you some of my answers because that's what I know, but always, always caveat all of this with if your lived experience tells you otherwise, if your tradition that you're already embedded in tells you otherwise, if your lived experiences tell you otherwise, then go with what you think, of course, obviously. Anyway, um, so yeah, take whatever of this might seem useful or applicable, modify it as you see fit, and leave the rest behind. But there are a few web strands that most of us have, and we'll be kind of looking at that. So part of the whole point of strong roots and wide branches is at some point I had looked around and realized that a lot of folks who were identifying themselves as polytheists were really kind of fighting in the dark, trying to figure out how to craft something from nothing. And so when it doesn't even occur to us that new pieces might help put the whole together better, we tend to default to whatever pieces are kind of already in there. And for a lot of folks that I have been in relationship with, that I have supported over the years as a priest and as a magic person and all the various things that I do, a lot of folks are coming to me where their background is culturally Christian, even if they weren't raised Christian or even if that's not their current orientation, magically, spiritually, religiously. Um, and so often what would happen is that God or Jesus singular monotheism perspective, the God part would sort of be taken off. I don't want that part anymore. Now I believe in three gods. Now I believe in a pantheon of gods. I particularly really like this one or two or five. But the only way I know how to interact with the numinous or with deity or deities is from this playbook that is what I was vaguely raised with, near, in, adjacent to. And the thing is that most of the polytheist gods whose names we know from history, even if their religious traditions haven't survived, they came out of an entirely different context. They came out of an embedded context. In the past, people may have worshipped a god out of a pantheon or all of the gods in a pantheon, or maybe they didn't pay all that much attention, maybe they did, but their entire framework was different. And the context in which polytheism existed was a full framework. It wasn't just I'm doing things the way that I've always done them in a monotheistic, Jesus-oriented way, and now I have two gods instead of one god. Now I have three gods instead of one god, and the rest of it hasn't shifted at all. When we gods are embedded as much as any of the rest of us are, and so when we start to make those transitions into what might it be like to be a polytheist as opposed to being a monotheist or an atheist or an agnostic or some other thing, our whole framework kind of needs to shift in order to make a space for that. And so part of what I've been trying to do with the strong roots and wide branches approach is go, hey, here's something you may not have thought of. What are you doing in terms of relationship with ancestors? And how might that be useful or important in your relationship with the gods? What are you doing about your relationship with the land that you live on? How is that maybe different or the same or informed by your polytheism? Hey, your gods come from a specific tradition, a specific culture. Is that applicable or not? What does that look like? What about human community? How do your own morals and ethics shift if you change? Because changing a perspective from being a monotheist or an atheist or an agnostic to being a polytheist is a shift. It is a shift. Everything needs to shift, not just I've swapped out the one God for two or three gods. So when we start to shift everything, then we kind of have to reevaluate everything. This is why I talk about relational polytheism as the focus. And as we kind of go through the strong roots and wide branches modality of evaluating and asking questions, we're going to kind of keep coming back around to what does healthy relationality look like? So that's some of what we're going to be talking about today. See, I'm looking at my notes. Let's see. So today we're going to talk about perspective shift and how this shift can inform our daily lives in both small and large ways. And I want to get into some of this idea of relationality. Today's main conversation is going to be about collaboration and relationality in all of the different levels. So we'll be talking some about gods, but we're going to be talking about a lot of things. We're going to be talking about perspective shift. So let's start with the self. Let's start with just you as an individual. Just like the ecosystems in which we participate, a single human is also a collective. We're also an ecosystem or a biome. We're an ecosystem of cells, of organ systems, identities, memory, and history of our upbringing and of our blood. We inform and are informed by the people around us and our own histories and hopes for the future. So we are not a singular. I mean, we operate as a singular, but we're not. We're not. Even if you look at your own physical makeup, these are some of my favorite metaphors. Biology is where my best metaphors and mythology comes from, by the way. I'm a nerd like that. So when we look at the composition of your own body, most of us think about, oh, like my body is made up of cells that contain DNA that I inherited from my biological egg donor and my biological sperm donor. And those, that DNA came together and that has shaped entirely who I am. And that's not untrue, but it's a lot more complicated than that in a bunch of different directions and for a bunch of different reasons. One of the things that makes that more complicated is that if we were to strictly do head count, not by weight, but by head count, single cells that do not share the DNA that you inherited from your biological egg and sperm donor outnumber your body, we'll call those body cells, outnumber your body cells 10 to 1. You are 10% by head count body cells that contain the DNA that you inherited. You are 90% by head count a whole scattering of other things. What other things? Those other things may include various kinds of bacteria. That includes commensal bacteria, which is bacteria that just kind of sits there, like it's neither good nor bad. It doesn't hurt you. It doesn't do anything. We have beneficial bacteria. We have some harmful bacteria at any given time. We have these kind of three categories: good guys, neutral guys, and bad guys. We have possible, yeast and mold that can start to live in and on our bodies. We have body cells from other people. That's a fun one. That's an interesting conversation, but not necessarily a lot of them, but they're there. But our body cells are significantly larger than most of these other kinds of cells that we're going to find floating around. But we're like talking about head count. But even looking at body weight, something like, I don't know, what is it, 1 to 2% of our body weight is actually single-celled organisms that are not our body cells. Something like 8 pounds of bacteria live total on and in your body, mostly in your digestive tract. So I think that's fascinating and beautiful. That means that if we're going to be functioning and operating as a collective, we need to kind of have everybody pointing in the same direction, which is towards health, I guess, wellness, functionality. We need to be able to be functional. Even if we take the piece about cells out of it, our body is made up of organs. Each organ has its own job. Each organ is doing its own thing. The organs themselves are organized into systems. Each system has to exist with the other systems and work together. But they're still kind of doing their own thing, but together in a collective. When we leave the realm of metaphorical, we leave the realm of physicality, then we start looking at things like what shaped us into the person that we are right now. Who taught us how to speak? Who taught us how to do all of the normal, everyday little things that we do? Where did we come up with these ideas? We are the product of culture. We're the product of our upbringings. We're the product of our communities. We were shaped by whatever was happening inside the uteruses that we developed in, right? There were factors while we were gestating that impacts who and what and how we are right now. So even a single person is an ecosystem, is a biome, is a collective. But most of us don't think of ourselves as we think of ourselves as I, because when I am speaking, I am taking the sum total of all of these different parts, these physical parts, these psychosocial emotional parts, my history and my present and my context and all that kind of thing, the roles that I wear, the relationships that I have, and I am still speaking as I, right? So this is useful. This is important. So when we're looking at relational polytheism, we're looking at those spokes in the wagon wheel. One of those spokes, one of those relationships we need to be maintaining is our own self. Right? You can think of groups of people functioning in the same manner with varying levels of formality and stability and varying levels of complexity. So what role do you play in your family or in your friends group or in organizations you may be a part of or in companies you might work for or jobs you might hold? We also function, or in your neighborhood, right? I mean, we also function in these both formal and informal multiple levels of where we ourselves are a cell in a larger body or an organ system in a larger body. Some of those are very formal and formalized, and we have very formal named roles, et cetera, et cetera. Some of those may be very informal, like the role that we happen to play while we're sitting on the bus, and everybody in the bus is in relationship because we are all on the same bus together, for good or for ill, right? So we can only do what we can do, but we always have some role to play in larger relationships, in larger uh, groups of people, in these sorts of larger relationships. So, again, we're going to see similar function. When do we speak with a single voice and when do we speak with multiple voices? Sometimes it is that formal and sometimes it's not, but the theory kind of still holds. When we're looking at, so there's another wagon wheel, lineage, ancestors and descendants. In Santeria, I'm going to talk for a moment about one of the traditions that I have initiation in. Whenever I, whenever I talk about traditions that I am a part of, I want to name that I only know what I know and my interpretation of what I know. And different people from the same tradition may wrap some of this stuff up differently. And I only know what I was taught by my elders, and I hope that I do as good of a job as I can speaking to that. But even if you're from the same tradition, you may understand these things differently. So don't take me as necessarily the one and all be all expert on any of this kind of stuff. But in Santeria, as I was taught it by my elders, we have a concept that we call egun. We, the living practitioners, the living initiates, are the currently living face of this collective of ancestors of the tradition, the ancestors who came before us. We also have an understanding of Egun, like we have our personal Egun, our family, the lineages of the dead who came before us that we're related to. As far as I'm concerned, just so that I say it, adoption is exactly as valid as blood. And if you are adopted, you are part of the lineage that you're adopted into. That's how initiation works as well, right? I've been adopted into that lineage. I went through all the formal stages to become part of that lineage. So, as I understand it from my elders, The relationship between Orisha and initiate is vested in Egun, not between the individual person and Orisha. It's a triangle. Orisha, Egun, we are the face of Egun, right? And so the relationship is actually there. Um, it's not just the singular relationship between a single practitioner and their individual crowning Orisha that facilitates the capacity to initiate at all. When we initiate, we're joining a lineage that already has a relationship with the tradition. The relationship is vested in the lineage, not in the individual. That's why it's a direct transmission initiation. You cannot self-initiate into Orisha tradition. You have to be welcomed into the lineage by others who already carry the permissions and authority to welcome you in. That authority comes from the passing of lineage from an ancestor to the crowning of their new descendant. Does that kind of make sense? I know it's not like that in every tradition, and none of this is to pass any judgment on traditions that wrap this up differently. There are traditions that one can self-initiate into. There's lots of other ways of interacting with the world. I'm just talking about, as I understand my specific lineage of Santeria. You can't self-initiate into traditional Santeria. You have to be crowned by somebody who has the authority to crown you. And what gives them authority is the hands that crowned them. It's our lineage that gives us access to Orisha in that specific way. There's other ways to have access to Orisha. This specific traditional formalized way, this is how to have access. Because again, we see ourselves as a collective. We just happen to be the living face of Egun, but Egun is lineage. And when we lean on lineage, when we listen to Egun speaking, we're listening to a collective that's speaking with a single voice that we are willing to be guided by because we're part of that collective. We're future ancestors, whether we ever crown somebody or not. Even if I never crown somebody, I'm part of the same lineage. After I have passed on, future practitioners who came through the same lineages as me, when they call on Egun, they're also calling on me. So I'm a future ancestor. All of us are future ancestors of whoever and whatever we're part of, right? So we also have that wagon wheel. And again, we're looking at this kind of collective thing. We're going to keep coming back to this collective stuff as we explore each of the different spokes in the wagon wheel. Transitioning a little, talking about the gods themselves. I believe that gods themselves function similarly. Now, we're going to start by talking about the Matroni, who are my favorite. Some of you who may already know me know that I can talk about the Matroni for many, many hours without break, but that's not what I'm going to do today. But I'm going to name them because I want to talk a little bit about, again, this idea of collectivity, that this idea of larger collective bodies. So if we look at the Matroni worship of ancient Rome, the Matroni were understood as a collective, where the whole was stronger than the sum of its parts. The Matroni, just a brief overview for those of you who don't already know me or don't already know about the Matroni. The Matroni were worshipped in Rome from about the 1st to the 5th century AD. We only know about them because of archaeological finds. We actually don't have any surviving writings or mythology or anything like that explicitly naming or describing them. But we do have about 7 temple complexes and over 1,100 surviving inscribed plaques, altars, and statues scattered across Europe, talking about them, naming them, showing imagery of them, and all that kind of stuff. If we look at both the iconography and the inscriptions themselves of surviving material artifacts of Matrona worship, we see hints of an understanding of these collectives as existing as a kind of, broad spectrum collective slice of the world. Now, what do I mean by that? So, for example, we might take the Matroni Veteranae, the Matroni of soldiers. So often when you would see these inscriptions, they would be given some sort of epithet. So Matroni Veteranae would be the Matroni of soldiers. That's what that means. So who were the Matroni of soldiers? Were these just a handful of goddesses that soldiers worshipped? Not exactly. Again, if we start looking at the iconography and we start looking at the material culture around it and all that kind of stuff, we're looking at something like a collective that would have included all of the deities in the region associated with warfare and with soldiers and with fighting. All of the various goddesses and other entities that were worshipped by those soldiers, whether they were explicitly warfare deities or not. We would be looking at, in addition to that, probably dead soldiers, warriors who have come before, the animistic spirits of weaponry itself, the sentient battlefield, the spirits associated with battle and with warfare and violence and rightness and whatever else. It wasn't just a handful of goddesses. It would have been the entire slice of the unseen forces and spirits and beings that were associated with, that would support and care for and bless and give luck to soldiers, right? That is the Matrone Veteranai. Likewise, the Matrone Aberenai were the Matrone of the Rhine River. So what would that have been? Could have been, we would have been looking at all of the deities, nymphs, and other categories of beings associated with the river itself, plus the dead who died in the river, dead fishermen and boat makers, merchants, all of those whose lives were dedicated to interaction with the Rhine River, the deities that oversaw any of those activities, the river itself, the spirits of land and place and space and time associated with the Rhine River. So again, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. By praying to the Matrone, you weren't praying just to goddesses. You were praying to the big picture. You were praying to the entire slice of whatever it is that you were asking for. You're praying to the collective. And you're hoping that the collective speaks and acts with a single voice. As from the perspective of a worshiper, this is really powerful because a deity is going to have their own perspective on whatever your question is, whatever your prayer is. But the land is going to also have its own perspective. The dead are going to have their own perspective. The other sentient entities that, depending on your tradition, may have a variety of names and roles, etc., are also going to have their own opinions. You're asking for all of them to act in a coordinated manner on behalf of your petition, right? We can assume that the Matrone were probably fairly effective because given that, the most common phrase found in surviving inscriptions. Now, this phrase was found in other inscribed altars to many other deities as well. It wasn't specific to Matrone, but on pretty much almost all of the Matrone inscriptions that we have surviving, we're going to see votum solvit libens merito written on there, or even just abbreviated as VSLM, which translates roughly into person X paid his vow willingly and deservedly, meaning these surviving plaques, statues, temples, and other votive items were made after the Dedicant's prayers were already answered. We have 1,100 surviving plaques, more or less, and 7 temple complexes saying, thank you for answering my prayers, as opposed to, I'm making a prayer. So, I would argue that even supposedly singular deities still function both as collectives and as part of collectives. So, part of collectives, you might see pantheons in general, right? Deities are found in family groups, in community groups, etc. They have different roles. They lean on one another. They're interconnected with one another. You can't really entirely separate a deity out from their role in their pantheon. You can't really separate them from their pantheons. Some individual deities would have a retinue, right? Like you have deities like Frigga and her 12 handmaidens. So she operated with a team of support in some way, shape, or form. We have, I'm going to tend to kind of lean into Norse mythology because that tends to be where many of my relationships are. When we look at other collectives, we have Odin, Vili, and Ve, or Odin, Honir, and Lothar, who created humanity and created the world around us. They operated as a team. 3 is a very important number in many, many different traditions. Even if you take an individual deity outside of their collective, let's take Odin, for example, who I love to talk about. We have Odin, we have his 2 wolves, we have his 2 ravens, we have all of his named weaponry, we have Sleipnir, his horse. So even aside from his relationships, We still have a deity that has named retinue. We have, so he operates, as far as I'm concerned, from a mythological perspective, if something has a name, it has some kind of a sentience. So if a weapon has a name, it has some kind of a sentience. If a horse has a name, it has some kind of a sentience. Odin has all of these things. They're all named. We know the names of all these things. So even Odin operates. I mean, and that's even aside from the part where Odin has something like, oh, I'm going to mess this up. What is it? 200 epithets that we know of. It may be more than that. There was a list at some point on Wikipedia of all of his epithets. There was a lot of them. I think it was something like 200. So when we look at any deity that has multiple epithets, or even multiple names, these are going to be different aspects. So I believe that there's a story of belief maybe coming from Greek mythology about, I think it was Zeus. I'm so sorry if I'm going to mess this one up, but I think the story went something like there was um, an army that lost a war because their leader called on the wrong epithet. They were told which epithet to call upon, I believe, of Zeus, and they called the wrong one, or they didn't call the epithet at all, and they lost because they didn't get his attention in the right way. They didn't use the right name. So now this starts to look like maybe a deity is vast and not just an invisible imaginary camp counselor, single person that's watching over us and can only pay attention to one thing at a time with a human perspective. I think deities are more complicated than that. We're not going to get into a tremendous amount of deities. No, let's go for it. Let's talk a little bit more about this. But um, other pieces to weave into this when we're looking at deities. What is a deity? I don't know. I don't know. Your mileage may vary, and what a deity actually is going to be different depending on tradition as well. Another deity I want to bring into the conversation here when we're looking again at singular deities who still seem to function as a collective, just the single deity functioning to some degree in a broader way than just a single individual way. Ariadne. Why am I bringing up Ariadne? Because Ariadne is the Lady of the Labyrinth, and in my exploration of her mysteries, she seems to function both as the one who can guide us through the labyrinth, but she's also the labyrinth itself. When we navigate the labyrinth, we're navigating her body. So this brings in this idea of a deity also as a landscape, right? Deities can be landscapes. They can be the ones that navigate the landscape. They're the ruler of the landscape. The deity is also the landscape. Certainly, there's plenty of stories about. No, I don't want to get into that. Never mind. And then we have, of course, deities existing in pantheons where they counterbalance each other in all different kinds of ways. When this is part of how I shape my own polytheism, when I'm trying to interact with a deity, I want to look at what their relationships are because it's important to know who I'm dealing with. Certainly, and again, when we get into this, your mileage may vary. Always, 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 always going to say that. Your way of doing it is your way, and your way is correct for you and potentially for your group. When I look at the surviving mythology, for example, about Odin and Loki, if one drinks, so does the other. They're blood brothers. It says so in the Eddas. We have Eddas, and the Eddas tell us that if one drinks, so does the other. So, ritually speaking, if I'm making an offering to one, I'm going to make an offering to the other, at least as a nod to in a polite way, because they're interconnected. There's a type of connection there that, as polytheist, I want to make sure I'm honoring those connections because gods exist in networks, and so do I. I want to honor their networks just as I would want them to honor my networks. There's levels of formality and informality with all this kind of stuff, and all of these things are somewhat fluid, right? What else do I want to talk about with regard to deities? Part of how I wrap up my understanding of a deity, again, when we're looking at, like, if I get to be a collective, right? I'm a massive cells that are all trying to kind of move in the same direction. Then metaphorically, I kind of understand gods as being similar. I like to call this one, let's see if I can if I can get the words. I've done this metaphor quite a bit over the years, but I like to call this the Kaiser Permanente theory of deities. What in the world do I mean by that? When you call up, we're gonna say Kaiser. When you call up your health insurance, your HMO, um, you're calling a building, you're calling an organization, you get somebody on the phone. That person has a series of phone protocols that they are required to use when they're talking to you. They're scripted. And that guarantees that whatever interaction you have with agents of that company, you're going to have a pretty uniform, most likely, set of interactions. It doesn't matter who happens to answer the phone that day. They're working from the same phone script and they're operating from the same set of principles. There's a type of branding that goes into how all of those relational scripts come through. So when you are talking to customer service, you're talking to Kaiser Permanente. You're not talking to the individual person who answered the phone in the same way. They're there as a representative. Anybody you interact with within Kaiser is operating under Kaiser's way of doing things. So you're interacting with Kaiser, right? You might be interacting with Kaiser Allergy as opposed to Kaiser Customer Service, as opposed to Kaiser Emergency Room or Kaiser Maternity. But either way, it's still Kaiser. So there's still a unifying principle that makes the conversation be what it is. My understanding of the gods is that they kind of function like that. If Odin is Kaiser, oh gosh, that's terrible. If Odin is Kaiser, you want to make sure that you're going to the correct department because you're not going to get your bone reset in Kaiser maternity in the same way. I mean, they could, but it's not going to be nearly as efficient or effective. That's not really where they want you to go. So we're going to try and call on the right part to get the outcome that we're looking for. This is also why, for example, a deity is able to be in more than one place at the same time. A deity is able to be in more than one opposing sides of a conflict, right? Deities are not giant invisible humans, and their thought processes, if they have such things, I don't think functions in the same way that a human brain does. Deities are vast forces of nature or the overlying sentient way of wrapping certain core things up. There's things that are consistent, but they're also greater than the sum of their parts. So there's a type of collective sentience that becomes a single deity. I would argue that deities are probably include retinues of, again, whatever in their mythology might be their name, tools, and weapons, and animals and helpers, their various types of retinues. I would argue that a deity probably also includes the dead who worshipped them or who maybe even acted as their clergy. I don't know, when those people were alive. And so then all of those individual pieces can kind of act as part of this greater collective, as this whole. But when they are speaking as the name deity, they speak with a single voice and they act with a single intention. So that's part of my current theory is that, again, that God's function is a type of collective made up of, the dead who worship them, the regions where their worship emerged, their associated households, weapons, animals, entities in their retinue, as well as whatever ineffable qualities that unites those individuals into a whole and lets them speak with a single voice. So it's complicated. Deities are complicated, but that's my current working theory. So again, we're kind of looking at collectives and where they exist in all these different places. When we oath or initiate to a god, to a pantheon, or to a tradition or lineage, then we become a cell in that larger body, and in some cases, that much more formalized body. This doesn't mean that across the board we have automatic authority to speak on behalf of a god or a lineage or a tradition. But it does mean that we functionally become part of this living body that is whatever that greater thing is. So, like, for example, as a crowned priest of Oshun, when I'm formally functioning in that role, it's my responsibility to present myself ethically and well, because I'm acting in part as Oshun's representative to the world, which is a big responsibility and one I feel both honored to be able to occasionally carry, but also one that I want to do as effectively and well and gracefully as I'm able. So, um, if I were to put a name to all of this, we can kind of name this as a type of animism as well. So I've been talking about this as like relational polytheism, but it's animistic relational polytheism because it's this idea that consciousness exists on these multiple levels, that we can have individual consciousness, but we can also have multiple consciousnesses of a variety of sorts coming together to be able to make a larger meta consciousness that can then function as an individual. So that's how I understand a person. That's how I understand a landscape. That's how I understand a biome. That's how I understand lineage, ancestors, and descendants. That's how I understand the gods. And that's how I understand my relationship with the gods. This perspective is not even remotely unique to me. Um, some of where I picked up some of this way of understanding the world was actually learning spell casting and spell shaping from old spell books of Americana folk magic when I was a child. That's where I got a lot of my start in the what is now paganism and polytheism and witchcraft and the occult and la 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 la. Like I've just been that guy for many, many years. When I was in elementary school, I was probably, I don't know, I relatively recently at that point had learned to read. I think maybe I was in the second or third grade. My father went to New Orleans on a business trip and thought it would be cute to bring me home some spell books from one of the museums out in New Orleans. So I had a few spell books from Anna Riva to name that name. And reading through these spell books and just getting really excited about how to make amulet bags and mojo hands and all this kind of stuff, which I was 100% doing absolutely DIY out of my mother's spice cabinet and garden and the ground around me, finding various and sundry things to stick together to make spells because I was going to do witchcraft when I was 7, like you do. But one of the things that I learned in that process, that I picked up in that process, was this idea of the way to shape a spell is by taking little bits and bobs, pinches of things that contain properties that I want to weave into this full working that I'm doing. But as I was doing it, I realized you kind of have to sometimes ask permission. Sometimes I would go to take a spice out of my mom's spice cabinet or pick a weed out of the sidewalk or whatever. And I would get this sense of like, but I don't want to participate in your spell. It's like, oh, okay. Well, I guess we're not going to do that. But this idea of crafting a spell based on properties, right? This kind of resonance magic, which you find in cultures all over the world. This is, pretty widespread. I later initiated into an Afro-Cuban tradition that originates from the Congo, where I was taught much more clearly defined and traditional ways of doing some of this kind of spell casting and magic building. Um, so again, this idea of building out a spell by populating it with individual pieces, where each piece is itself sentient in its own way, or taken from something or somewhere that has its own sentience. And then weaving all of that together in order to build something new that's informed by the resonances of all these different things. But what's a resonance? It's more than just resonance magic, it's partnership magic. Each individual, in the case of the tradition that I'm initiated in, like each individual piece needs to be asked if it's willing to participate in order to be included in the whole. We're not just snatching things and shoving them into our spells. We're asking through formal divination, like, hey, I'd like to include you in this thing. Will you participate? What do you think? Um, So again, each individual piece is therefore has some amount of if you can ask it a question, it has some amount of sentience to it. We have this in Orisha tradition as well, where if there are pieces getting incorporated into some of our sacred items, we have to ask the pieces if they're willing to participate. What is created by the working itself, whether it's a temporary one-time spell or the fabrication of a new entity, who then becomes sentient in its own way, we still have the same concept of partnership and collaboration, of many voices coming together so that they can speak with a single voice. So, again, when we're looking at this kind of wagon wheel of relationships, and each relationship itself has some amount of, so we're looking at fractals. Each individual relationship has this, how do we participate? How do we build consensus, right? How do we collaborate? How do we do ethical partnerships and collaborations? So we have, again, a relationship with ourself. We have our relationship with our living human community. We have a relationship with the land upon which we're living and the land itself that we're directing with. We have relationship with ancestors and descendants, with our lineages. We have relationships with the gods. We have the things that we may build or create. We may have, depending on our personal relationships, depending on our personal religious traditions, etc., there may be a whole pile of other named beings that I haven't named here because they're not specific, because they're specific to you, but not to in general. Um, in each one of these places, we're looking at some similar potential stuff. We're looking at partnerships, we're looking at collaboration, we're looking at consensus building. We're looking potentially at least sitting in questions around reciprocity and consent. So a thing that I will say over and over again is how we do anything is how we do everything. So when we start looking at religion, at the religion, especially for those of us who may be stepping into a religion that no longer exists or that we're trying to create from new or rebuild after the original folks who used to practice that don't practice it anymore, that it may not exist anymore. We're doing a lot of kind of both excavation and recreation and creating from new. And when we're doing that, we kind of have to look at the whole big picture. So again, polytheism is more than just, hey, I found this one deity from some random pantheon that I feel a strong connection to. We can start really getting our fingers in and looking at, like, how do I do all of the different things? How are any of my decisions potentially different if I'm coming from a place of relationality? Relation, what is my relationship to the different factors, to the different pieces? Who is impacted by my choices? Who is impacting my thoughts and my decisions, both in this world and in all the others? Again, going back to that earlier analogy of a thriving forest, we have under the ground, we have at the ground level, which is kind of where humans live, and then we have the upper levels as well. So, you know, we're looking at, up, center, and down. We're looking at the world around us. Um, and you can see how as we start to unpack and rewire and rethink some of this kind of stuff, it makes potentially makes our daily decisions different. It makes the perspective that we walk in the world in potentially a little bit different. And so an interesting thought exercise then is, how would I operate in the world differently if I understood myself as part of a collective? If I understood myself as being a strand in a bigger web or a cell in a bigger body, if I understood that even my own body is made up of a collective of parts, what does consensus building look like? How is that different? So I'm going to leave you with those questions. I hope that you have found this particular conversation to be interesting and fun. I love talking about this stuff. As always, I'm going to remind folks that you can find me through Strong Roots and Wide Branches, through House of Apples. House of Apples is, we have a website, we have a Discord server, we have, we're on Facebook and Blue Sky and Instagram and all that kind of stuff. So look for House of Apples there. You can look for Strong Roots and Wide Branches. You can look for River Devora. Wherever you found this podcast should have a little blurb that will have links for where you can find us for all that stuff as well. I would love to continue the conversation if you have your own thoughts or feelings about any of this. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to do some closing prayers. So, blessings and thanks to all good spirits. Thank you to all who attended this podcast. Thank you to this moment in space, place, and time. Thank you to the land upon which I'm standing. Thank you to the guardians and guides and the protectors, the way openers and the way closers. Thank you to the ancestors and descendants, to the lineages. Thank you to my allies and friends. Thank you to the vast guiding forces that know and shape destiny. Thank you to the web from which all things come and to which all things return. Thank you to all of the blessed powers that watch over House of Apples and Strong Roots and Wide Branches. And thank you, my listener, for hanging out with me for a little bit while we talk about this kind of stuff. I hope you're well. Blessings and thanks. Hail and farewell.